After my husband and parents left me over not having kids, they were shocked to see me with a baby girl 3 years later. Hey, so I'm a 30-year-old woman and recently had this super awkward run-in with my parents and my ex-husband Scott, who's 33. Seriously, I'm not even sure how to process that meeting. For some background, my parents and I haven't spoken in almost 3 years, and it's the same story with Scott. We got divorced 3 years ago and haven't been in touch since. I've done everything I can to keep them out of my life because being around them really messed with my mental health, to the point where I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs to start fresh, away from all of them and everything tied to my past. So bumping into them again was a massive shock, and I kind of blurted out some things to them that I'm not sure were the smartest moves. Growing up, my parents always wanted a son. They didn't treat me badly, but it was clear I would have had it differently if I were a boy. My mom even mentioned it a few times. I tried really hard to be the son they never had, but just didn't succeed. After college, I tried to keep in touch with them because, they were my only family. I wasn't close to my grandparents, and I didn't really have any uncles or aunts in the picture. So, despite them not showing much interest, I tried to keep a relationship with them. Then, when I was around 23, I met Scott at a concert. We hit it off and started dating. 6 months in, I introduced him to my parents, and suddenly they were trying way harder to stay in touch with me. They called more, asked about my relationship, and generally seemed more interested in my life. I noticed the change, but didn't question it too much because it was honestly nice to have them involved for once. After dating for a bit over 2 years, Scott and I got engaged and eventually married after 3 years together. Things were great for a while, but about 6 months in, my parents started dropping hints about wanting a grandchild. I was only 26 and really wasn't ready for that. I wanted to wait a few more years, but because they insisted, I talked to Scott about it. He was all for starting a family, so we decided to give it a shot. We tried for what felt like forever, but nothing happened. We got tested and found out I was infertile. It was a big shock for us, but more than us, my parents were majorly disappointed and didn't even hide it. When we broke the news, my dad just walked out instead of offering any comfort. Scott and I talked about trying IVF, but it was expensive and success wasn't guaranteed right away, so we decided to hold off until we were more financially ready. We were okay with waiting, but my parents were not. They basically ghosted me, stopped visiting, and ignored my attempts to explain it wasn't my fault. I felt so let down by them that I called them out on their behavior. I told them they were being cruel just because I couldn't give them a grandchild right now, and that it made me doubt they'd even be good grandparents if I ever did have a kid. I told them how they'd treated me badly my whole life because I wasn't a son and how differently they treated Scott. I had ignored it for so long, but now I was done trying to keep the relationship alive. I asked them to just stay out of my life. It was tough because I had wanted their approval for so long, but I realized it was never going to happen. Instead of apologizing, they doubled down and basically said they were fine with never speaking to me again because I was worthless since I couldn't have kids. It hurt, but at least I knew where I stood with them. After that call, we were done. I told Scott about it, and at first he was super understanding. But soon, I noticed he started acting differently towards me. I tried to brush it off because I was already dealing with a lot mentally and didn't want to face the idea that my husband might leave too. I pretended everything was fine, but within a few months, he was like a completely different person and was cold to me all the time. I tried everything to fix things, so I really gave it my all in my relationship, doing everything I could to make it work. But after 3 months of trying, he walked in one day with divorce papers and said he was done. I mean, I wasn't totally surprised, but it still hit hard. I tried to talk him out of it and said we could think about having kids later on, but he wasn't having it. He just wanted everything over and done with ASAP because it was tough for both of us. The divorce dragged on for nearly 7 months, and man, those were some of the hardest times in my life. I was on my own and really struggled to keep it together. Things got even messier when, a couple of weeks after he left, I found out from some relatives that Scott was crashing at my parents' place. I thought maybe chatting with my in-laws could help, so I reached out. That convo was super awkward, but they told me my parents had been whispering in Scott's ear for months, convincing him to leave me. Even my in-laws thought it was a bad idea, but Scott had fallen out with them too. The wildest part was hearing that my own parents might have told Scott he could do better than me. I have no idea what exactly was said, but it felt like my parents just wanted a son however they could get one. And since I wasn't talking to them anymore, and they couldn't expect grandkids from me, they latched onto Scott and drove a wedge between us. I felt totally shattered after the split, but after some time, I managed to pick myself back up. I moved to the suburbs, found a new job, revamped my look, and cut them all out of my life. I even told my close friends and relatives not to give me updates about them. It's been 3 years now, and therapy has been a lifesaver. I'm doing pretty well, but I still longed for a baby. So last year I decided to go for IVF and got pregnant with the help of an anonymous donor. 4 months ago, I welcomed my baby girl into the world, and life has been pretty great since. Then, about 4 days ago, I was just taking a walk with her, and out of nowhere I ran into my parents and Scott. They were just leaving a house a couple of blocks away, which was a total shocker. They came over, said hi, and started asking about the baby because they thought I couldn't have kids. I told them the truth and began walking away, but Scott stopped me. He actually thought bumping into me was some kind of cosmic sign that we should give it another shot. My parents chimed in too, suggesting we chat about everything I'd been up to since they'd missed out on so much. I was just floored that they could even suggest that after everything. It took me 3 long years to move on, and I'm still working on myself in therapy. So I kinda lost it and told them I'd rather invite a pack of wild animals into my house than them. I called them out for pretending to care about me now just because I had a baby. My parents were interested because they finally had the chance for a grandkid, and Scott was only here because things hadn't worked out for him elsewhere. It was infuriating to realize they only saw me as a baby factory, and not as a person with real feelings. They abandoned me when I needed them most. My parents always made it clear they preferred having a son, and that a woman's worth was tied to motherhood. But what really stung was Scott, who I thought was my partner. He just went along with whatever my parents said and bailed when I was at my lowest. I reminded them of all the hurtful things they'd said, suggesting they leave me alone since I was apparently worthless to them. Honestly, I've always been the quiet type, but that day, I let them know exactly how I felt. So I'm usually a pretty shy person, but that day when they confronted me in the street, something in me just snapped. I ended up yelling at them like a maniac, letting out 3 years' worth of pent-up anger. It got ugly, and once I was done letting them have it, I made a quick escape back home, slammed the door shut, and immediately felt super sick about the whole thing. I ended up taking a couple of days off work to just chill at home with my baby, trying to process everything. The argument I had with my parents and Scott kept replaying in my head, like a never-ending loop. I was totally lost on what to do next until last night when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I let those go to voicemail, but for some reason, I picked it up. Surprise! It was Scott, and I could hear my parents whispering loudly in the background, not even trying to hide. I told him not to call me again or I'd have to take further steps, something I really didn't want to do, and the same went for my parents. I made it clear. I was done with them. But Scott insisted on talking, saying he and my parents realized they screwed up. Apparently, they were all just disappointed about the whole starting a family thing and my infertility. He begged for a second chance, but I wasn't buying it. I told him flat out they only cared because they saw me with a baby. My parents chimed in, accusing me of being selfish back then, wanting comfort after my infertility news while they were also struggling to process it. That's why they ended up pushing me away. I hung up after that, knowing they were just gaslighting me, but I admit it got me doubting myself. I figured I should reach out to Ida for some reassurance. People were asking why my parents didn't try for another child if they wanted a boy so badly. Well, turns out my mom had a tough time with her first pregnancy, and doctors advised a long wait before trying again. By then she was in her mid-30s, making it risky. Like me, she struggled to conceive, but had to deal with a nasty mother-in-law instead of her own mom. So they ended up with just me, despite wanting a son. As for Scott, he was an only child, always treated well by his parents, so it puzzles me why he latched onto mine. I never kept in touch with Scott's parents after our fallout, but they seemed to have a good relationship. The past few years I've just been trying to forget it all. But now, thanks to you guys bringing it up, I feel like I need to talk to my ex-in-laws and get some answers. Update. I decided to reach out to Scott's parents to get to the bottom of his behavior. It makes no sense why he'd visit his aunt with my parents. I'm sure it's not my fault. My family abandoned me when I needed them, and they're just trying to gaslight me. Anyway, I hope this clears things up for anyone who had questions. Hey everyone, so here's the scoop. I was just looking for some reassurance and didn't want to burden my friends with something this personal, so I posted here. Thanks a million to everyone who assured me that I wasn't the bad guy in all this. It was super awkward to reach out to my ex-in-laws after 3 years without contact. The last time we talked was around my divorce, but they were surprisingly happy to hear from me. After some small talk, I got straight to it and asked why Scott was so buddy-buddy with my parents. Turns out, a few months after their last big fight, they patched things up with him and are still in touch. Scott also kept in contact with my folks, mainly because they'd always been sneaky about getting him on their side. Even back when Scott and I were dating, my parents would invite him over for dinner without me, which he thought was cool because he figured he'd impress them just by being himself. Honestly, my parents were already impressed just because he was a guy. Scott saw my parents as extra parental figures, even though he had great parents of his own. My folks also showered him with expensive gifts and checks. That was the money Scott offered to use for IVF when we were together, but I thought he was bluffing since we didn't have that kind of money. I never wanted him to do anything shady for cash, and he didn't want to tell me about his financial ties to my parents because it would have meant coming clean about their weird relationship. I refused IVF because I thought he was broke and wanted to save up, and that's when my parents manipulated him into thinking he deserved someone better. Over a few months, they brainwashed him and he left me. My ex-in-laws apologized and explained they didn't agree with Scott's relationship with my parents, but didn't want to cut him off since he's their only son. I get it. They didn't owe me anything and were just being nice by telling the truth. Now that I know the whole story, I'm done with them. They're not worth my time. Update time. I finally got back to work after nearly 2 weeks off. Thankfully, I have plenty of maternity leave left since I didn't take the full 6 months at once. The company's policy is pretty flexible. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, who I completely trust. When she called me halfway through the day, she said she took my daughter to her place because my ex, Scott, was causing a scene outside my house. I let them stay with her and immediately called the cops while rushing home. Apparently, Scott had been yelling and trying to kick the door in, and my daughter was crying. My nanny acted fast and called me so I could alert the police. She then left through the back to her place nearby, keeping my baby safe. Huge props to her for prioritizing my child's safety. Once I got home, the cops were already there, and Scott was clearly drunk. At noon, of all times. I decided to press charges and get a restraining order since he was acting crazy. They took him away, and later my nanny brought my daughter back home. I gave her the rest of the day off because I wanted to spend time with my kid. Looks like I'll have to take a few more days off work, but I'm not complaining. I get to hang out with my favorite person. Update 3. It's been a few weeks since my last post. I got busy with the baby and a new project, which has been pretty exciting. As for my parents and Scott, I secured the restraining order against him, thanks to security footage from his drunken visit. My parents seemed to be keeping their distance after seeing his meltdown, and my ex-in-laws told me they've decided to also stay in touch with Scott. He's been having a tough time finding someone to start a family with, even though he really wants to. It's not like he can start a family without a partner, and he's not into adopting. That might explain why he was acting out the other day, but it doesn't mean I have to forgive him, especially after all he's put me through. And that includes the stuff with my parents, too. They just won't stop bad-mouthing me to other family members, which is just sad because everyone knows they were the ones who did the worst to me. Them trying to play the victims now is just ridiculous. They had to learn the hard way that's not how things work. Anyway, I'm relieved they'll never get to meet their grandchild. I'm not going to let that happen. My daughter and I have an awesome life ahead of us, and no one's going to mess that up. I'm definitely going to be a way better parent than they ever were to me.